So, did you guys hear that parable? We're all trying to ignore it, right? Because it's really, really crazy and confusing. I mean, did that landowner really just commend the guy for losing him even more money? It sounds ridiculous, right? And you know what? All those explanations that Jesus gives afterwards, well, they just made me even more confused. So what's a good child of the light to do but to just shrug our shoulders, turn the page, and move on to the much more open and understandable parable of the rich man and Lazarus? But you know what? We have to wait until next week for that one. So today, we're going to figure this one out. The interesting thing is that I discovered when sifting through my computer files that I have actually preached on this text. It was 12 years ago, in 2010. Anyone remember what was going on in 2010? Well, maybe you can figure it out if I read the parable to you the way I read it to people in 2010. There was a rich country that had many bankers managing their money. Charges were brought forward that some of those bankers were collecting commissions for giving big loans without making sure that there were a good risk and that people would be able to pay them back. Now, they bundled together these bad loans into packages that made it even more difficult for people to tell if they were good or bad loans that were in those packages. And then they started to sell them back and forth between their banks and paid each other big commissions for all of this. The rich country summoned the leaders of the banking industry before them. What is going on? People are losing their homes and the whole financial system is collapsing around us. Submit your resignation and give us an accounting of your management so that we can start to untangle this crazy mess. Then the managers said to themselves, what will we do if we can't be bankers? So they went to people whose homes had been foreclosed and asked, how much is your monthly payment? If the answer was $2,000 per month, they said to the homers, take your payment and make it $1,000. And the rich country commended those banks that modified mortgages because they had acted shrewdly. People still had homes to live in, and the financial system did not completely collapse from toxic assets. So you can see how quite amazingly this topsy-turvy parable, well, it somehow made sense when I was looking at it in 2010 in light of that financial crisis that's, I don't know, about a dozen years ago now. I think it still has something to say to us today, too. I mean, we got through that mess, and yet somehow those huge disparities and power imbalances that led to that particular crisis, well, they are worse than ever today. And guess what? Here we are again, arguing over whether or not loan forgiveness is good, sound economic policy. Now, I don't think that Jesus was trying to give the disciples or us economic policy advice. Nor do I think that this is a morality tale that's just about wealth. See, this human mess that Jesus has laid out before us, it goes way beyond those mere topics of economics and wealth. How do we know? Well, the clue is there in who is listening to the story as Jesus tells it. We have to go back to chapter 15 to find out. The tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law, well, they were muttering against them. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. See, it's for that audience, the eager outcasts and those grumbling religious leaders that Jesus launches into a series of parables. We heard some of them last week, the lost coin and the lost sheep. There's also the prodigal son that fits in there. And of course, next week we move on to the rich man and Lazarus. That context means that this parable that we heard today, it has to have something to do with grace. So here we have Jesus. He is hanging out with the very people who the religious and cultural leaders of the time say are just without hope of blessing from God. And Jesus tells one story after another that says in no uncertain terms, you're wrong. The very ones who you think are the least worthy, they are the ones for whom God searches the hardest and the longest and celebrates the loudest when they are welcomed home and found. So even before they get to this parable, I am guessing that those Pharisees and those religious leaders are already thinking, this sounds crazy. It makes no kind of sense to them. Kind of like we're struggling with it today. Because that offer of complete acceptance and forgiveness from God, well, it does not make sense to us. Because it is truly meant to be topsy-turvy, at least from the perspective of human logic. Jesus is using this parable of dishonest steward to show us and his audience that the logic of grace, it works so much better than our logic. Jesus, he has huge well of compassion for the whole mess that humans can get ourselves into when we get blinded by self-interest. Every character in this story has something that, is a bit self-serving in how they're all in a bit of a pickle, shall we say. I mean, that landowner, he was off in the city just enjoying the high life. He wasn't really paying any attention to what was going on in his properties. And the steward, well, he abused the trust of his master, and he wasn't doing a very good job, which is why he was on the chopping block, right? And then there's those poor peasants who are just in debt way over their heads. With the way things stand, at the beginning of the story, the dishonest manager, he's probably going to be thrown in prison. The peasants, well, they're faced with unpayable debts. They'll probably end up just abandoning their holdings. And then, where does that leave landowner? Is no one to work his fields. They're just going to sit fallow and fall into disuse, and then no food, right, to feed the wider community. So, a lot like the 21st century, business as usual, well, it's not going to fix this huge bind that they've all gotten themselves into. Now, the thing that turns it all around, it's this bold act of forgiveness, not a policy decision, but in the truest sense of the word, forgiveness that completely erases what cannot possibly be repaid. Because there's a lot of hyperbole in the debts that Jesus is talking about. They're so huge that there's no way that those peasants could repay them, no matter how hard they worked. Through this act of forgiveness, their livelihood, their very lives are being restored to them. With this parable, Jesus demonstrates not just what God's grace is, but how it can and does make sense. How the impact of grace is so powerful that it just grows and grows and grows. The landlord, well, he experiences that unmerited acceptance from the village. The peasants, they're freed from their crippling debts. And now that manager has a community that will welcome him. Jesus is telling us this is the craziness. You take that craziness of the world, you take all that greed and that fear and that self-interest and the broken relationships and trust and lives that go with it, and then see what happens when you flip them over. You meet them with that same kind of crazy topsy-turvy acts of love, forgiveness, and justice that we have experienced from God. That is how the kingdom of God spreads. Think about a time that you've experienced an act of grace. Now, whether we were the originator of that act, or we were the one who received that kind of love or forgiveness or acceptance, or whether we were just someone standing by and we saw it unfold in our family or in our community, we get caught up in its path because it kindles in us a kind of renewal of relationship, a glimpse of things becoming more the way God intends them to be. And you know what? That makes us more willing to go out and do that again, to act that way again. So after hearing today's readings, we may or may not be convinced that loan forgiveness makes economic sense. But it's clear that sharing God's grace through acts of forgiveness, well, that makes spiritual sense. It rebuilds shattered relationships, it reconnects strained communities, and it spreads justice around us. So, parable perfectly clear now? We all got it? Well, I know if we can just recognize the audacity of God's grace and then use that same graciousness in our relationships with each other, then I think we've definitely got what Jesus is saying here. But what about that statement by Jesus right at the end? You cannot serve God and wealth. Now, it is hard to ignore the issue of wealth when it's sitting right there. So there's something in this parable that's also meant to be about money. Now, Jesus' prime message to his audience of Pharisees and tax collectors may have been about God's grace, but it seems like Luke chose to position and then explain the parable in a way that includes a message about the use of wealth. And Luke's audience is an early Christian community spread far and wide across the ancient Near East. Now, there's a lot more to Luke's theology of wealth than we can cover in one sermon. But the one thing that I think is being emphasized in this parable is something that we can't ignore. How we use what we have received, especially our wealth, reveals who we are and who we serve. Serving God by using wealth shrewdly, well, that's the way to go. Of course, in that topsy-turvy, upside-down sort of kingdom logic that we were talking about in relationship to what Jesus was up to, I think we can take the word shrewdly to mean graciously. Because when we use wealth to respond compassionately to the suffering of all of those around us, well, it actually mirrors the grace that we've received from God. Acting graciously towards someone, it has this knock-on effect that goes way beyond any of us. And so that includes how we use the resources that we've been given by God, including our wealth. And that's true whether we've been entrusted with very little or very much. The turning point for everyone in this story is something that the steward does. His act of forgiveness of debts, a concrete act that has definite economic repercussions, is what sets up that chain reaction. The peasants give him praise for the master and hospitality to the steward. The master decides that he's willing to actually absorb what would have been a huge loss on his balance sheets, makes the debt reductions permanent, and he commends the steward. It was only after the concrete act of debt reduction that shifted everyone's relationship. That's what got the hearts to start to change. I think sometimes as Christians, whether we find ourselves with the need to be faithful with very little or very much, it's easy to get stuck. paralyzed by all of the pressing needs out there that we would love to respond to with this kind of graciousness. I mean, I know I run up against it every time I pull up to a stop sign and there's someone there who's in need, holding up a sign. Do I just give a feel-good handout that offers that person little in the way of long-term solution to their predicament? I mean, maybe I could be doing more. Meanwhile, the light, here goes the cars in front of you. You're still waiting. Maybe I could do more to more effectively end poverty. And then here comes the cars in the other direction. But it's not clear how much or I can do with what I have or what I can even spare. And can what I have really even make that much of a difference? And then bing, green light, whoosh, lost that opportunity, right? Luke seems clear. Shrewd stewardship of whatever we have been given by God involves doing something concrete that responds compassionately to the needs that are right there in front of us, no matter what state of spiritual or financial readiness we might find ourselves in. Because God's kingdom, it's initiated by a completely unmerited gift of grace from God, brought to us in the person of Jesus. But its continued unfolding, that happens every time that we who received that gift become the givers in real and concrete ways. So I think that the kind of shrewdness that Jesus promotes is a shrewdness that gives and acts and serves and loves and forgives just as abundantly as we have been given and loved and forgiven by God. We don't need to get hung up on getting all of our strategy and motivations down before we can step out and do anything. The type of kingdom that Jesus proclaims, it's not based on love and forgiveness and transformation later. It's something we get going with right here and now. So Jesus' crazy sounding parable, it does make one thing clear to us. God sent Jesus to show us what God's grace is really all about and how we get to be swept up in its path so that we can turn around and pass it on to others through concrete, generous acts of love and justice and giving.